Well, we've got an update on the case against Julian Assange. Apparently, they have revised the indictments against Assange. The U.S. Department of Justice issued, because they're trying to extradite him over here and essentially, throw the book at him. And of course, because Assange after 2016 is now for some reason associated with Trump and being against Hillary, the mainstream left is very happy about this. You see all the journos happily tweeting out, Assange is not a journalist. He's evil, bad, Russia, Russia, Russia. And if you look at the indictment, what they're saying is that essentially they think that Assange is guilty of, I guess, conspiracy to hack stuff, and that because his sources illegally obtained information, well then, and because Assange published it, he is an accessory to that crime. Because if he's getting this information from these people, he's conspiring with them. They're saying, hey, we're going to go get some information from the government, and Assange is saying, yeah, I'll publish that because that's what I do. This, according to the DOJ, is a crime. That's not protected by the First Amendment. They said the same thing before about his dealings with, then Bradley Manning, because Manning had to, I guess, put in a password to get into the files that they then copied to, thumb drive or something, I think was the story, and handed it off to WikiLeaks. They're also taking that crime and pinning it on Assange. And so the implications of this are very major. What essentially the government is saying is that if you are, operating as a journalist and you publish information from a source that obtained that information illegally, well then that is against the law, and you will be held liable for whatever crime was committed to obtain that information. And so what that means, to be more specific, is that the only information about the government that it is legal to publish is the information that the government officially puts out. Because if the government doesn't officially state these things or leak these or give these things to the press through official channels, if somebody leaks it from the government, then that's illegal. And so the American press, is not allowed to publish things that counter the government's public narrative. Freedom of speech now only includes, I guess, opinion. You can say, I think the government's wrong, but if you have evidence that the government's wrong, you're not allowed to publish that and say, look, the government lied to us. Here's this video of 3 journalists being killed in Iraq by the U.S. Army. And normally you would think, well, this is a Republican administration. You've got a long-time Republican Attorney General, Bill Barr, somebody who helped, cover up the Iran-Contra scandal. You would think that this would be a really big story that journalists would be totally against the government on, and they'd say, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Sadly, the state of journalism is such that, no, they are still cheering this on. Because the mainstream press does exactly as they're told. They do exactly what I just said. They only publish what the government officially gives them. They go to these press conferences every day, and they write down whatever the government spokesman says, and then they just put that to print. If the government kills a bunch of civilians in Lebanon, and at the press conference they say, we don't kill any civilians in Lebanon, the only people that we kill are terrorists, and if they're blown up with our bombs, then they're terrorists. And so then the press will take that and they will report the Pentagon only blows up terrorists. If someone within the Pentagon wanted to come out and say, no, the spokesman is lying, we actually know that these are civilians and that there's only one suspected militant amongst this group, and we just blew up an entire cafe, killing probably 20 people to get one guy who was suspected of being a bad guy, that person's not going to get published by the press. The press doesn't want to hear anything about it because that's more difficult. It's much more work to do real journalism and try to develop real sources who have inside knowledge. It's much easier just to take whatever you're told and type that on your laptop and then click publish. And so I think it's really that simple. I don't think that it's as much the political thing as a lot of people would think. I mean, I think the fact that all the Russia, Russia, Russia stuff is part of the reason why the journalists have no respect for Assange and don't want to defend him, even though in principle, they should. It's in their best interest to defend him because, they'll be next. But, in reality, they will not be next. Because what's happening to Assange is not going to happen to someone who just is a stenographer that writes down what they're told. I'm torn over whether I think that this is a big deal or not, because on the one hand, if you're looking at the long term, this is a terrible precedent to set, obviously. It's basically saying that the government has a total legal control over the narrative surrounding its actions. And then if a government decides to classify anything, then that classification applies not just to the government employees who see it, but to anyone else really in the country who sees it. So if something leaks out, you don't want people to know that you found out about that. It really is just broadening the scope of the enforcement of government classification. But with everything going on right now, how enforceable is that? I mean, the government can't even keep statues up. You think they're going to keep their secrets safe? I mean, it really seems like the U.S. government is just, falling apart at this point. And so, how do you reverse that? If the government's just giving itself new powers, I mean, are these just the death throes? It seems to me like the ultimate collapse of the U.S. government, is becoming a greater and greater possibility. With all of this, unrest and the lack of social cohesion, does it really matter if our government says that, we're not allowed to question it, essentially? The only way that the government, has the power to make laws if people follow those laws. And if, the majority of the people are just up in arms and angry and not listening to anyone, let alone the government, the government doesn't have much power to enforce these edicts that they hand down from on high. And so while I do fear greatly for Mr. Assange, and I don't want to see him, crucified in this way, I'm not totally convinced that at this point, we're entering, a period of, some kind of Soviet-style dark age, to where there's just, absolutely no freedom of speech in America. I mean, I think that, no matter how you threaten people, as long as we have the internet, at this point, it's going to be very hard to put that genie back in the bottle, the genie of transparency. So Mr. Assange, definitely, while being a trailblazer, and someone who, is being shot down, kind of like, what's his name, from Napster, the guy who started, mass internet music piracy. Well, now, even though Napster was shut down and that guy was ruined financially, I believe, internet piracy has not gone away. It's stronger now than ever. And so we might be able to say the same not too long from now when it comes to stuff like WikiLeaks. This sort of, anti-state action, I don't think is going to go away. So with that said, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.